Hey there, Bearded Homeschool Mom here. In the last video, I talked about some things you can do to make sure your family's prepared for an emergency or the unexpected, just in case there's a pandemic that catches you by surprise. And I said I'd make some videos covering some of those things. Today we're going to start on some sourdough bread. I'm going to do a couple videos on that. Today I'm just going to focus on the basic ingredient, the starter. You can't make a bread without some sort of yeast, something that makes the dough rise. The bread at the grocery stores, you buy it off the shelf, has a commercial yeast in it. You can also buy the commercial yeast at the grocery store to make your own bread. There's a big difference though in what's used in commercially produced bread and bread you make at home with a sourdough starter. It's a completely different product. So what is sourdough bread? When I was younger, I used to think sourdough bread was bread that tasted sour. While that's sometimes the case, that's not the defining characteristic of sourdough bread. 100 years ago, sourdough bread was called bread because there wasn't a distinction between sourdough and what was produced commercially. There was no commercial yeast like we have today, so all bread was made with a sourdough starter. Not all sourdough bread has a distinctive sour taste. The bread I make on a daily basis really doesn't have a strong flavor. That's not my goal. I could make it taste stronger if I wanted to. And I may experiment with some other things to try to do that. Because sometimes that's the flavor people are looking for. Me, typically, I'm just looking to make a healthy bread. The sourdough starter is the leaven that makes the bread rise. And it does this because the starter hosts a colony of yeast and lactic acid bacteria, which are living organisms. That may sound really weird that you're introducing, living organisms to the food that you eat, but, it kind of sounds a little gross if you think about it. But let's think about it. There are a lot of things we eat on a daily basis and consume that are made with the same process. Yogurt, beer and wine, any distilled alcohol, it's done the same way. It's fermented, and that's what's happening here. The process of fermentation. It sounds weird, but you kind of just have to accept that. It's what we've been doing. Pickles, whatever things you eat all the time and you don't think of, are created using little living organisms. What the bacteria and the yeast do is they break down the sugars and carbohydrates in the flour and the ingredients in the bread and convert it to carbon dioxide. So you have the flour, water, and whatever else you put into it mixture with the leaven added, in this case the sourdough starter, and over time that builds up carbon dioxide gases, which make little tiny air bubbles, and therefore inflating the dough. So that way you have something ready to put in the oven. It rises, you have bread instead of a very dense, cake of cooked flour and water. Well, now that I've made this whole thing thoroughly weird, let's move on to making the sourdough starter. You'll need just a few things. I use a glass jar. Typically I will use a larger one, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm just using the pint-sized jar I found in the pantry. And this is fine for making small batches. If you just want to make a loaf one loaf every day or two, or a week, whatever. If you're going to be making more bread than just the occasional loaf, then you may want to use something larger, like this little guy here, a quart jar. I have a couple of these that I use because I make some bread. This guy right here I fed this morning, you see, is full. But for the sake of demonstration and just moderate baking, pint-sized glass jar is fine. You'll need something to cover it with. If you do internet searches, you'll see a lot of people use a pretty piece of cloth with a rubber band or something around it. That's fine. I just use the lid. Just don't crank it down. And the reason you don't want to crank it down is because inside you're creating a starter, and like I said, the bacteria and the yeast are going to consume the carbohydrates in the flour and create carbon dioxide, therefore expanding, and this will just explode. You crank it down, building up pressure, not a good idea with a glass jar. Other things you'll need are flour, some water, and something to stir with. That's really it. There's not much to this. Okay, so here we go. Got a 1/4 cup of flour, and this is just regular white wheat flour. Approximately 1/4 cup of water, and stir. All right, so we've got the consistency of, I don't know, like peanut butter right now. So a little more water because we don't want peanut butter, but we don't want it to be real liquidy either. So just a little bit more water. And almost there. All right, yes, so that was exactly a 1/4 cup of water. All right, so basically, you can see the consistency there. There's goo. So that's what you want, and take this, put your lid on, do not tighten it, and it helps. If you have a little bowl or something to put it in, when this thing takes off, it could get a little out of hand and spill over, so you'll be glad you did that. And that's it. So we have just done the first step of making a sourdough starter. Okay, so now that we've got our sourdough starter mix begun, you can't just leave it. So you have to feed it occasionally, and you'll have to find what works best for you. Your internet research will tell you, some sources say, feed it every 8 hours. And feeding it just means you're discarding part of this because the process is beginning, but you don't really have everything created yet. So you have to dump out some. I dump out about half of it and add another 1/4 cup of flour, another 1/4 cup of water, and just keep going and keeping it the same consistency. I do it typically when I'm starting one out. I'll probably do it about twice a day. So I'll do in the morning, I will discard, feed it, and in the evening I'll discard and feed it. And then it really just depends on nature. In about a week's time, you should have an active starter that will grow to be more like this. This started out this morning. I just added flour and water to what starter I had left to about 1/3 of the jar. And it's completely full right now. And if I don't do something with it, this one may actually overflow. That's it. Now, how long this process takes depends on environmental factors, temperature in the house. So it's going to take a little longer in the winter than it's going to take in the summer. Suggest keeping it at room temperature at the beginning. Just keep it out on a counter. But you'll know it's done when it's clearly increasing in volume after you feed it, and the final product, man, it looks weird. So if I pour it out here, it looks like some kind of strange, mutant symbiote. Slimy and gooey, full of air bubbles, and yeah, it looks kind of gross. But, I mean, that's what we make bread with. But that's how you'll know. So as far as storage, if you're going to be making bread on a regular basis, I would just suggest you leave it on the countertop. If you miss feeding it for a day or two, no big deal. Just, you'll have some liquid form on the top. You can either mix that in or dump it. It really does not matter. Just do your discard, feed it. After a couple of feedings, it'll come back to life, normal. I've even stored it in the refrigerator for many, many weeks, forgotten about it, take it out a couple of feedings, and it's fine. I would suggest storing it in the refrigerator if you're not going to be making bread on a regular basis. Just if you're going to do the occasional baking, get it fed a couple of times, get it, invigorated, make your bread, and store your starter in the fridge. It'll keep for a really long time. That's really all there is to it. So we'll let this sourdough starter come to life and turn into something we can make bread with. And my next video, maybe I'll show you how to make something like this or this. So that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.